So you're talking about being over fat and the insulin response to that. So I've heard you talk about that before, and that's something I wanted to ask you about. So there's an insulin response to being over fat, not just to consuming carbohydrates in our diet. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Absolutely. Right. So you have these subcutaneous fat cells under your skin, right? And they can all expand to maximum diameter. Once you've expanded them all to the highest diameter, then you have to sprout new baby fat cells under your skin. Now, everyone has a genetically inherited ability to sprout new fat cells. And some people's ability to sprout new fat cells is extremely low. And they have what is called a low personal fat threshold. People from Southeast Asia, for example, if you're from India or one of these countries, you might not be able to expand your number of fat cells very much at all. And what happens is once you've sprouted all the fat cells you can under your skin, and once they're all expanded to their maximum diameter, which is around 200 microns, then your body's forced to store fat in your visceral cells. And at this point, none of your cells want this fat. And so your insulin level starts going up higher and higher and higher, because the job of insulin is to clear energy out of your bloodstream and shove it into cells for storage. So it's like blowing up a balloon. Once you get to the upper limit of the size the balloon can reach, you have to constantly blow into it as hard as you can. And the second you stop blowing, all the air comes rushing out of the balloon. Your fat storage is the same way. Like a type 1 diabetic, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you don't take your insulin, what immediately happens is every bit of fat in all your fat cells just comes rushing back into your bloodstream. And you literally melt down all this energy in your body. It eventually ends up as glucose, but you're melting down all your stored energy into burnable energy in your bloodstream. Insulin is like a fuel sensor in your bloodstream. And whenever the fuels in the bloodstream goes up, insulin shoves all the fuels back into storage where they're supposed to stay. So your fat is constantly trying to come out of your fat cells, but insulin's shoving it back in there like a dam that's holding back water. Once you fill the dam up to the very, very brink, which is what happens if you fill up all your subcutaneous fat cells and all your visceral fat cells, and now you've got ectopic fat in your liver and your pancreas. And once you've shoved in all this fat everywhere, the dam of insulin you're secreting 24/7 to hold back all this energy, to hold it into circulation, is very, very high. So, like, for example, my fasting insulin level might be a 1 or a 2. I could have a hugely overfat pre-diabetic or diabetic come in, and their fasting insulin level might be 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 or 70, or I think 90 is the highest one I've ever seen. And then when these people eat, their insulin goes up by a factor of 10 or 20 or 30. So you just have this massive, massive wall of insulin at all times that goes up even higher after you eat, as your body's desperately trying to keep all this energy stored and out of your bloodstream. And that's why hyperinsulinemia is energy toxicity. You've literally shoved too much energy into your body.
Oh, that's a fabulous explanation. It's quite scary, actually.
Mm-hmm. It is.
It is. So what about people who have been overweight or obese for a long time? You know, like the struggle of trying to reduce weight, and then sort of the long-term effects of the energy toxicity. Is that a problem?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of problems there. First of all, if you've proliferated your number of fat cells, you've really, really affected how lean you can get in the future. So let's say I only have 10 fat cells on my whole body, right? I can diet down to the point where all 10 of those cells are maybe half full. And I can walk around that way. I'm fairly comfortable. If I try to diet down to where these cells are 10% full of fat, I will be starving out of my mind 24/7. My leptin is the factor there, right? So leptin will be so low that you're just absolutely starving. So I can basically shrink my fat cells down to maybe the 50% level, kind of like the gas tank in your car. And my fat cells are okay with that. I can sort of walk around that way and I'm fine. But if I was on, my 600-pound life, this show, and I have 1 billion fat cells, well, I can shrink all my fat cells down to this 50% level, and maybe I'll lose 300 pounds. But if I try to go below that, I'm just extremely hungry, and it's just a real struggle. So the reality is that if you've ever been really over fat, you're never going to get quite as lean as someone who is never over fat to begin with. Now you can shrink down your fat cells so much that your insulin is actually down to normal and your blood sugar is down to normal and you're metabolically quite healthy, but you'll still visibly have a higher body fat percentage than someone who was just always thin their whole life. So once you have been over fat, it's a lot harder to get really low body fat levels, but you can still achieve a very healthy metabolism, even if you have more fat cells than other people. It's like someone who lost a lot of weight and they have all this excess skin sitting around and they have to have skin removal surgery. Sort of the same concept where you're just going to have a little bit more body fat than people who are never over fat to begin with.
Right. So what you're talking about there is sort of the set point theory a little bit too, isn't it? That we have
correct. Right.
Innate control system that wants to keep us at a certain set point.
Right.